In 1992, Ford's engineering team in Dearborn received a report from Brazil that made executives go pale. A farmer in Sao Paulo had modified his Ford 1000 to run on pure sugarcane ethanol and squeezed out 250 horsepower from an engine originally rated at 130. The discovery. The report landed on desks stamped urgent. Regional managers in Sao Paulo had been hearing rumors for months. Farmers across the interior were bringing their trucks to small-town mechanics, asking for the same modification, something that made their vehicles run hotter, faster, and cheaper than anything Ford had engineered. When investigators finally tracked down the source, they found him on a 1,000-acre sugarcane farm 3 hours outside the city. His name has been lost to history, deliberately scrubbed from Ford's internal documents, but mechanics who worked with him called him João, just João. Ford sent engineers disguised as agricultural equipment salesmen. They needed to see this modification with their own eyes. What they found terrified them. João's 1000 was running on ethanol so pure it was basically moonshine, with a compression ratio increased to 14.5 to 1, modified fuel injectors, and a timing advance that should have destroyed the engine in weeks. Instead, the truck had been running flawlessly for 18 months, over 60,000 kilometers. The engine wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. And when they dyno tested it at a local shop, the numbers were undeniable. 251 horsepower, 87% more torque than stock. The engineers reported back to headquarters with a conclusion that made Ford's legal team immediately get involved. This modification violated every warranty agreement Ford had in Brazil. Rewind to 1973. To understand why this modification became a revolution, you need to rewind 2 decades to when Brazil's economy nearly collapsed. The oil crisis of 1973 hit Brazil like a freight train. The country imported 80% of its petroleum, and when OPEC turned off the taps, gas prices quintupled overnight. Lines at filling stations stretched for blocks. The government watched its foreign currency reserves evaporate. Brazil was drowning in oil debt with no way out. Then someone remembered Brazil's greatest natural resource wasn't buried underground. It was growing in fields across the country, sugarcane. Brazil had been producing sugar since colonial times, and sugarcane produced ethanol, lots of it. The math was simple. Instead of importing expensive foreign oil, Brazil would grow its own fuel. In 1975, the government launched ProAlcool, the national alcohol program. It was the most ambitious alternative fuel initiative the world had ever seen. Billions in subsidies, mandatory ethanol blending, tax incentives for farmers, and pressure on automakers to produce ethanol-compatible vehicles. Ford, Volkswagen, and General Motors had no choice. If they wanted to sell cars in Brazil, they had to build ethanol engines. But here's where it gets interesting. These companies didn't want ethanol to succeed too much. Because if ethanol became the dominant fuel, it would disrupt their global supply chains, their parts standardization, their entire business model built around gasoline engines. So they complied with the letter of the law while quietly sabotaging its spirit. They built ethanol engines that ran, but barely better than gasoline equivalents, sometimes worse. Cold starts were nightmares. Performance was gutted, fuel economy disappointed. The message was clear. Ethanol was second-rate. Brazilian farmers and mechanics saw through this immediately. They knew sugarcane ethanol had higher octane than gasoline. Ethanol's octane rating sits between 100 to 108, compared to gasoline's 87 to 93. Higher octane means resistance to engine knock, which means you can run higher compression ratios, which means more power. The chemistry was undeniable. So why were Ford's ethanol trucks so underwhelming? Because Ford designed them that way. They used the same compression ratios as gasoline engines, around 9 to 1. They kept conservative timing. They installed fuel systems that couldn't take advantage of ethanol's properties. It was engineering handcuffs disguised as safety margins. For most people, this was just frustrating. But for João, a man who'd spent decades coaxing maximum yield from stubborn soil, it was an insult. He was growing the fuel in his own fields. He knew its potential, and he was tired of Ford treating him like he was stupid. The farmer. João grew up in the interior when farming meant survival, not business. His father had worked land that barely produced enough to feed the family. By the time João inherited the farm in 1978, he'd learned every lesson rural Brazil could teach. How to fix equipment with wire and hope because new parts took months to arrive. How to modify irrigation systems because factory specs didn't account for local conditions. How to squeeze productivity from resources everyone else said were exhausted. Farming made you an engineer, whether you wanted to be or not. When ProAlcool launched, João saw opportunity. The government was paying premium prices for sugarcane destined for ethanol production. He expanded his operation, took loans, planted every available hectare. By 1985, he was producing enough cane to supply a local ethanol cooperative and fuel his own equipment. That's when he bought the Ford 1000. It was marketed as the perfect farm truck. Ethanol, compatible, tough, reliable. The dealer promised it could handle anything. João drove it off the lot and immediately felt disappointed. The truck was gutless. Loaded with supplies, it struggled on hills. Passing slower vehicles required planning and prayer. The engine felt like it was working twice as hard to do half as much. His old gasoline Chevrolet from the 70s had more spirit. Something was wrong. He started asking questions. The dealer blamed the fuel. Maybe his ethanol batch was contaminated? João knew that was nonsense. He was running the same ethanol that powered the cooperative's equipment perfectly. He consulted mechanics in town. They shrugged. That's just how Ford's ethanol engines are. Accept it or sell it. But João wasn't built to accept things. He started reading agricultural magazines, engineering journals from the university library, import manuals on internal combustion theory. He learned about stoichiometric ratios, ignition timing, compression, and he realized Ford was leaving power on the table. Massive amounts of power. Ethanol needed more fuel volume than gasoline because it carried less energy per liter, but also contained its own oxygen, meaning combustion could be more complete. Ford's fuel maps weren't accounting for this properly. They were running too lean, too conservative. He also discovered something that made him angry. In the United States, Ford was experimenting with flexible fuel vehicles that could run on 85% ethanol. Those engines used higher compression ratios, advanced timing strategies, and modified fuel delivery. The technology existed. Ford just wasn't bringing it to Brazil. They were selling Brazilians inferior versions of their own innovation. That's when João decided to stop asking permission and start experimenting. His workshop became a laboratory. He pulled the cylinder head and had a local machining shop shave it down, increasing compression. He modified the fuel pressure regulator to flow more ethanol. He adjusted the distributor timing by hand, advancing it until the engine pinged, then backing off slightly. Every change was tested. Every modification documented in notebooks he kept locked in his desk. And slowly, the truck transformed. It started pulling harder, running smoother, sounding meaner. When he finally took it to a mechanic with a chassis dyno in a neighboring town, both men stood in silence watching the numbers climb. 251 horsepower. The mechanic looked at João and said, "You just made Ford very angry." Here's exactly what João did, and why Ford wanted it buried. The stock 1000 ethanol engine had a compression ratio of 9.2 to 1, conservative enough to run on gasoline in an emergency. João increased it to 14.5 to 1 by milling the cylinder head and installing thinner head gaskets. This alone wasn't revolutionary. High-performance engines had used similar techniques for decades, but combining it with ethanol created something special. The high octane prevented detonation even under extreme compression, extracting energy that gasoline engines could never safely access. Next came fuel delivery. Ford's injectors were sized for gasoline's stoichiometric ratio of 14.7 parts air to 1 part fuel. Ethanol needed 9 parts air to 1 part fuel, meaning you needed to inject significantly more volume. João installed larger injectors from a flex fuel experimental program Ford had abandoned. He found them through a parts dealer who didn't ask questions. Then he modified the fuel pressure regulator, increasing baseline pressure by 30%. This forced more ethanol through the larger injectors, enriching the mixture to optimal levels. Timing was the dangerous part. Ford's factory timing was set conservatively at 8 degrees before top dead center. João advanced it to 22 degrees. This meant ignition occurred much earlier in the compression stroke, giving the expanding gases more time to push the piston down with maximum force. On gasoline, this would cause catastrophic knocking. On pure ethanol, it was magic. The engine developed a distinctive bark, a sharp crack from the exhaust that announced its presence from half a kilometer away. Other farmers started recognizing that sound. That's João's truck. That's the one everyone's talking about. The final piece was cooling. Higher compression and advanced timing generated more heat. João installed a larger radiator from a Ford diesel, added an auxiliary transmission cooler, and fabricated a heat shield for the fuel lines to prevent vapor lock. The modifications cost him $187 in parts. Most of the work he did himself in his barn over 3 weekends. No computer programming, no specialized diagnostic equipment, just mechanical sympathy and refusal to accept artificial limitations. The results were intoxicating. The truck now hit 100 kilometers per hour in 11 seconds, compared to 18 stock. It pulled loaded trailers up mountain roads without downshifting. Fuel economy actually improved by 15% because the engine operated more efficiently at optimal mixture ratios. And reliability? After 18 months and 60,000 kilometers, João hadn't replaced a single internal component. The engine ran cooler and smoother than stock because it was finally working the way ethanol engines should have been designed from the start. Word spread through the agricultural community like wildfire. Farmers talked at cooperative meetings. Mechanics whispered at parts suppliers. Within 6 months, dozens of trucks across São Paulo and Minas Gerais were getting the João modification. Some mechanics started offering it as a package deal. Bring us your Ford, pay $300, pick it up in 2 days with double the horsepower. Ford's warranty claims started arriving. Blown head gaskets, cracked pistons, destroyed transmissions. Every single one was a truck running João's modification. The company's initial response was predictable: void all warranties. These modifications violate federal emission standards and safety regulations. Any vehicle altered this way is no longer covered. But the real panic happened in closed-door meetings, because engineers analyzing the failures realized something disturbing. The engines weren't failing because of the modifications. They were failing because owners were pushing them beyond transmission, and drivetrain limits never intended for 250 horsepower. The modifications themselves were mechanically sound, actually brilliant in their simplicity. And if that information became public, if Brazilian consumers realized Ford had been deliberately underutilizing ethanol's potential for over a decade, the lawsuits would be catastrophic. Forget warranty claims. This was fraud. This was selling inferior products while possessing the knowledge to build superior ones. Let's talk about what 250 horsepower from agricultural waste actually meant for these farmers. This wasn't just about speed or bragging rights. This was economic survival. A farmer hauling 3 tons of sugarcane to the mill in a stock truck needed 2 trips. With João's modification, 1 trip. That's half the fuel cost, half the time, double the profit margin. On farms operating at thin margins, this modification was the difference between staying afloat and selling out to corporate agribusiness. The performance gains were almost violent for anyone used to stock ethanol vehicles. Drivers reported the first time they floored a modified truck was genuinely frightening. The engine note changed completely, becoming aggressive and urgent. The acceleration pinned you back. The pulling power felt limitless. One farmer described it as the difference between a horse pulling a cart and a bull. Same job, completely different experience. And the best part? They were fueling these beasts with ethanol distilled from their own crops. The independence was intoxicating. Fuel economy improvements confused people at first. Higher horsepower usually means worse fuel consumption. But João's modification actually increased efficiency by running the engine in optimal ranges. Stock Ford ethanol engines ran slightly lean, causing incomplete combustion and wasted fuel. The modification richened the mixture to stoichiometric ideals, meaning every drop of ethanol burned completely, extracting maximum energy. Farmers reported 10 to 15% better fuel economy while towing, even more during highway driving. The math was undeniable. More power, less fuel, lower cost per kilometer. Ford had been selling them expensive underperformers for years. The community aspect transformed rural car culture. Modified trucks became status symbols, not for wealth, but for independence and ingenuity. Farmers organized informal races on deserted roads. Whoever reached 100 kilometers per hour first won bragging rights and free drinks at the local bar. Mechanics competed over who could extract the most power. One shop in Ribeirão Preto claimed they'd built a 280 horsepower version using a custom turbocharger. These weren't rich playboys modifying sports cars. These were working people taking control of technology that had been deliberately limited by corporations who saw them as captive markets. Then came the moment that made this more than folklore. A popular Brazilian automotive magazine, Quatro Rodas, got wind of the modifications. They tracked down 3 farmers running João variants, convinced one to let them dyno test his truck, and published a feature story in November 1993 titled, "The Farm Truck Ford Doesn't Want You to Drive." The article included dyno charts, detailed modification lists, and interviews with owners praising reliability and performance. They even calculated that if Ford had built ethanol engines properly from the start, Brazil could have reduced petroleum imports by an additional 12% during the 80s. The story detonated across Brazil. Suddenly, this wasn't underground folklore. This was documented proof that Ford had been shortchanging Brazilian consumers for decades. The magazine sold out within days. Ford immediately issued a statement condemning the modifications as dangerous, warranty voiding, and potentially illegal under emissions regulations. They threatened legal action against any mechanic installing them commercially, but the cat was out of the bag. The article had published enough technical details that competent mechanics anywhere could replicate the modification. And more importantly, it had asked the question Ford couldn't answer. If a farmer with basic tools could extract this performance safely, why didn't Ford? The silence was deafening. Ford's response was swift and brutal. Any truck brought in for service showing modification signs got red flagged immediately. Warranty voided. Owners received letters explaining their vehicles no longer qualified for coverage due to unauthorized alterations. This scared some people back to stock configuration, but not enough. Most farmers had already accepted they were burning bridges with Ford the moment they made the modifications. Next came legal threats. Ford's Brazilian legal team sent cease and desist letters to every mechanic shop installing João modifications. The letters claimed violations of federal emissions law, threatening both mechanics and owners with fines and potential criminal charges. This was largely bluffing. The emission standards were vague, rarely enforced in rural areas, and the modifications actually produced cleaner combustion than stock engines. But the threat rattled people. Several prominent shops stopped offering the modification publicly, though many continued off the books. Then Ford played their trump card. They lobbied Brazil's automotive regulatory agency to classify high-compression ethanol modifications as emissions non-compliant, requiring engineering certification costing thousands of dollars. For farmers making a few $100s monthly profit, this was impossible. The regulation passed in 1994. Overnight, tens of thousands of modified trucks became technically illegal. But here's what Ford didn't anticipate. Rural Brazil had never been big on regulatory enforcement. Police in agricultural regions had bigger problems than checking compression ratios. Farmers kept driving modified trucks. Mechanics kept installing them. The underground network actually grew because the crackdown generated martyrdom narrative. You're not just modifying your truck now, you're standing up to corporate bullying. Behind the scenes, leaked internal documents revealed Ford's real fear. Not safety, not emissions, precedent. If Brazil forced Ford to acknowledge deliberately detuned engines, every market would demand better. Argentina was watching. India had ethanol programs. Even the United States was considering higher ethanol blends. The company's entire flex fuel strategy would collapse under scrutiny. João himself reportedly told a Ford representative, "You can threaten me all you want. I'll never put your gutless engine back. You should have built it right the first time." While Ford waged legal war, something beautiful happened. The modification became folklore, passed through networks corporations couldn't touch. Mechanics developed coded language. Farmers stopped calling it the João modification, where phone lines could be tapped. It became the agricultural package or the performance upgrade. Shops stopped advertising it. You had to know someone who knew someone. The mystique actually increased demand. A mechanic in Campinas named Roberto became legendary for perfecting the modification. He'd studied the original João specifications, then refined them based on hundreds of installations. He kept detailed records of every engine, tracking failures and successes. His version used slightly lower compression, 13.8 to 1 instead of 14.5, and more conservative timing at 19 degrees. The performance was slightly reduced, 220 horsepower instead of 250, but reliability improved dramatically. Roberto called it the sustainable version. His waiting list stretched 6 months. The network spread beyond Sao Paulo. Mechanics in Paraná, Goiás, even Mato Grosso started offering variants. Some focused on maximum power, others prioritized fuel economy. A few experimental shops tried forced induction, supercharging, or turbocharging the modified engines. Results were mixed. Ethanol's cooling properties meant it could handle boost well, but the truck's drivetrains couldn't. Shattered transmissions and destroyed differentials littered these experiments. The community learned through shared failure. The sweet spot was naturally aspirated, high compression, conservative tuning. Anything beyond that required redesigning the entire vehicle. Technology changed everything in the late 90s. The internet reached Brazil, and suddenly the underground network went digital. Forums appeared where mechanics shared specifications, farmers posted dyno results, and engineers analyzed combustion theory. What had been oral tradition transmitted through handshake deals became democratized knowledge available to anyone with a dial-up connection. Ford's attempt to suppress the modification became impossible. The information was everywhere, and with it came validation. University engineering students started thesis projects analyzing the modifications. Some professors quietly admitted Ford's conservative factory specs had always been puzzling given ethanol's properties. The academic community was essentially confirming what farmers had known all along. João had been right. By 2000, an estimated 40,000 vehicles across Brazil were running some variant of the modification. Ford had long stopped trying to enforce their legal threats. The regulatory agency had never seriously pursued enforcement. The whole thing had become accepted reality. If you owned an ethanol Ford in rural Brazil, you either ran its stock and accepted mediocre performance, or you modified it and joined the community. The modification even spread to VW and GM ethanol vehicles with similar success. What started as one farmer's frustration had become a cultural movement about ownership rights and corporate accountability. João himself stayed quiet through all of this. He never gave interviews to major publications, never tried to monetize his innovation. According to people who knew him, he found the attention uncomfortable. He'd solved a personal problem, not intended to start a revolution. When Quatro Rodas tried to interview him for their 1993 article, he declined. The magazine never published his full name or farm location. In later years, some automotive historians tried tracking him down for documentary projects. By then, he'd reportedly sold his farm and retired somewhere in the interior. Whether he's still alive remains unknown. He became mythology, which perhaps was fitting. His modification outlived his willingness to claim credit for it. Ford eventually, quietly, changed their approach. By the 2000s, their new flex-fuel vehicles used higher compression ratios, better fuel mapping, and more aggressive tuning. They never officially acknowledged the modifications or admitted their earlier engines were deliberately limited, but anyone comparing specs could see the truth. The 2005 250 flex-fuel model had a compression ratio of 12.5 to 1. The fuel system flowed 30% more volume. Performance was significantly better than 90s-era equivalents. João's modifications, dismissed as dangerous and illegal a decade earlier, had become factory specifications. The farmers had won, even if Ford never admitted defeat. The legal situation also evolved. The emissions regulation Ford had lobbied for was quietly amended in 2001 to allow high-compression ethanol modifications, provided they passed local emissions testing. Since the modifications actually produced cleaner combustion, this effectively legalized them. Mechanics could now advertise openly. Some even offered emissions certification as part of their installation package. What had been underground became mainstream. Auto parts stores sold high-compression gasket kits and larger injectors as over-the-counter performance parts. The industry had normalized what corporations once called criminal. But the human cost shouldn't be ignored. Some farmers who modified their trucks did experience catastrophic failures when they exceeded safe limits. Blown engines, destroyed transmissions, a few accidents where excessive power overwhelmed driver skill on poor rural roads. Ford used these incidents as justification for their original opposition, ignoring that proper education and gradual tuning would have prevented most failures. The company had created a false choice. Accept our inferior product or risk destroying your vehicle through dangerous modifications. The real option, Ford building proper ethanol engines from the start, was never on the table. The financial damage to Ford is harder to quantify. They lost goodwill in a market where trust matters enormously. Rural Brazilians have long memories. Many farmers who felt betrayed by Ford's deliberate underperformance switched to competitors when they eventually replaced their trucks. Volkswagen and Toyota gained market share through the 2000s, partially because they didn't have the same baggage of lying about ethanol capability. You can't measure that in quarterly reports, but it shaped buying decisions for a generation. Here's what really matters about this story. It's not just about horsepower or ethanol or one company's bad decisions. It's about the fundamental question of ownership in modern society. When you buy a vehicle, do you truly own it? Or are you leasing access to technology controlled by corporations that decide how you're allowed to use it? Joao's modification was a declaration of independence. He bought a truck with his money, fueled it with ethanol from his land, and improved it with his skills. Ford's response was essentially claiming that even though he owned the physical object, they still controlled how it could function. This battle is more relevant now than ever. Modern vehicles are computers on wheels. Manufacturers use software locks to prevent modifications. Right-to-repair legislation faces massive corporate opposition. Farmers again find themselves at the center, fighting John Deere over tractor software and unauthorized repairs. The echoes of Joao's story reverberate through every debate about digital rights management, jailbreaking, and user freedom. He was fighting a war that's still being waged, just with different weapons. The environmental angle deserves mention too. Brazil's ethanol program, despite corporate sabotage, reduced the country's petroleum dependence significantly. If Ford and other manufacturers had fully committed to optimizing ethanol engines from the start, the impact would have been transformative. Instead, they gave ethanol vehicles just enough functionality to comply with regulations, while quietly hoping the program would fail so they could return to gasoline dependency. Joao's modification proved clean, renewable. Domestic fuel could power high-performance vehicles if engineers were actually trying, instead of deliberately handicapping the technology. There's also a class element that can't be ignored. The farmers who embraced these modifications weren't wealthy. They were working people squeezing survival from difficult circumstances. When Ford tried to sue them, threatened their livelihoods, and lobbied for regulations to criminalize their innovations, it exposed whose interests the company truly served, not customers. Not environmental responsibility. Just shareholders and executives protecting a business model threatened by innovation they didn't control. The farmers won because they had nothing to lose and everything to gain. Ford had everything to lose and fought dirty trying to maintain control. Joao's story isn't ancient history. It's happening now. Manufacturers use software to block phone repairs, embed tractor kill switches, and lobby to criminalize independent mechanics. The same battle Joao fought in that Brazilian barn is raging in courtrooms worldwide. When companies claim modifications are dangerous, ask if they're protecting safety or control. If this inspired you, share it. Someone needs to hear that one farmer with basic tools beat a corporate giant. The dragon can be beaten. Sometimes it just takes refusing the word impossible.